Hello, everyone. Thank you again for supporting the State of Wellness. Thank you again for listenership. We have continued to grow and we're grateful for it. Today's show is a little bit different. We have a holiday weekend coming up, and our schedules haven't really permitted us as much to all be together. And given people's schedules and everything else, you're going to hear from each of us individually, perhaps a few times. And so just me and Gareth today. But certainly something that, obviously the holiday weekend coming up is Father's Day. And, as we're sitting thinking of recording, we do a show on mental health. And the more I thought about it, the more I am thinking of one of the first questions that I ask any child and parent whenever I'm doing an assessment for treatment in the clinic is, what's the home look like? And what I'm looking for is, what are the domestic relationships? I remember in graduate school, one of the things that was taught to us about how to look into these kinds of relationships was to, have children draw their family as animals, right? And then have them describe those animals to them and who they are. And honestly, how many times have the kids been drawing animals and there is just no animal that represents dad? It has become a routine absence in our culture. And I think we have overlooked, because of a railing against quote unquote traditionalism or religiosity in culture, we have overlooked that the values that are being promoted probably come from some of the root mechanisms of survival. Now, everyone who's listened to the show has heard our religion episode. People who have listened to the show have heard Sergio and I sort of challenging each other, even to the point of disagreement on some of those issues of faith. And that's fine. One of the things that we hope that a secondary benefit to this podcast is for people that can be really good friends, really good colleagues, and hopefully consummate professionals and still disagree with one another and practice and help people in general. And I think that's a great way to describe us and this show. But one of the things that perhaps people have learned about me, even though I haven't been terribly, what can I say, forthright, or at least not intentionally sharing, is that I depend pretty heavily on faith. And I grew up very much in a Judeo-Christian tradition. I grew up very much in an evangelical atmosphere. I went to church. We stayed at church late at night. We were there every time the doors were open. It was a part of the habits and the disciplines of my childhood. Interestingly enough, though, and as I'm talking about dads, my dad didn't really go until I was well into high school, and that was always an interesting dynamic in our home, because he was very much supportive of it, but didn't always act it out, and that's interesting. But it's a side note at this point. But I don't want to limit, and I guess one of the things is I have made the arguments, passionately so, in previous episodes about why I think faith matters, why I think it's important, but I'm not trying to force feed faith, particularly my faith, on anyone. And this is important to me, and it's not only important to me because, I'm trying to be neutral, or I'm trying not to, push anybody's buttons. If you have questions about my faith, I'll gladly answer them for you. I will be glad to explain anything that I think, feel, or believe. But sometimes I think we're a little bit too loose with our language and what we believe, quote unquote, right, is not always what we act out. And that becomes a weird psychological thing, because an outsider could easily say, hey, you don't believe that, right? The side note of my father coming up, but knowing and hearing his support for us going to church, my mother and I, whenever I was a child, and never coming, suggested maybe something about what he believed. But as an outsider, I'm not entirely sure that any of us were qualified to say that, right? But I also do fundamentally have this understanding, or at least this thought pattern that says, hey, I act out what I believe, or I will act out what I believe. I'll be glad to talk about my beliefs if that's something that is of curiosity. But one of the things that I don't think has any value is me trying to force beliefs on anyone, or me trying to use any kind of negative emotional tactic to coax someone into believing what I believe or how I believe, or to comfort me by pretending to do so. Right? And that includes even the biblical symbolism of hell. I'm not entirely sure if the immediate drive, or the only drive that we have for some kind of a religious pursuit, any kind of a religious pursuit, is to avoid eternal suffering. Who wouldn't do that if we really believed that there was eternal suffering, right? Who wouldn't take that if we really, but that's that door to the unknown that we don't know what's on the other side specifically, right? We get, and actually there's some scripture that I could quote here. I forget exactly where it comes from. I think it's in Romans or Corinthians, where it says, right now we see through the glass darkly, but then we're going to see it clearly. That example right there is one of the things about faith that is so unique. The scripture in Hebrews that says, faith is the evidence of things hoped for, right? Or the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. These are all aspects of faith that explain faith in this way that it's not empirical necessarily, but it is certainly not something that can be achieved through the scientific method, but it is nevertheless something that we all need to survive in some way, shape, or form, because we can't extract everything through the scientific method, and people have been living and enculturating and surviving for long before the scientific method was a thing. And religion and myth way predate science. And so it can become somewhat of an arrogant short-sightedness for us to overlook some of these sort of really, 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 what can we say, instanched traditions that exist in our cultures. And as we understand more and more and more about science and the way that we approach things scientifically, and I always like to make that differentiation, and that is, we can say science, follow the science, and we've done that in our culture with COVID and everything else, but what is really being said there is follow the pattern that we understand this. We don't like the pattern that you understand this. All we can do is apply the scientific method to the way that we think about all things. We can't make hard science out of everything. I've made that argument on this show several times. Physics, mathematics, most of chemistry, some of biology, right? Very little of psychology at this point is hard science. Zero of psychology, if you're asking me to make the argument. And not as much of biology as some people might want to prospect it, or that people might expect. However, that is also not to say that none of those things are valuable. They're obviously valuable. We need them. We use them. They can benefit us. And so the point here is to start looking at, if these things benefit us, why do we choose to ignore them because they exist in some tradition that maybe we don't agree with for some reason? for example, fatherhood. Why do we think that our culture just so hates the idea of male and female, seemingly hates it, right? And maybe that's too strong of a word. Maybe that's my emotional reaction. But it certainly doesn't seem like they value it, or that we value it as a culture, to the extent that science would show us that it is valuable if we use the scientific method to analyze just a few things about fatherhood. Now, I'm going to start out with some things that are a little bit more concrete, and then I'm going to move into some of the things that I think are more important, because the anecdotes and the stories and everything else, people who know me, people who've listened to the show know that those are the things that are valuable to me. Sergio's the science guy. But let's start with a little bit of scientific method here. One, I have made an argument for this book several times on this show, but it's called The Boy Crisis. It was written by a couple of PhDs. Warren Farrell's the one that I know the best. I've listened to Warren Farrell on a few podcasts. I've listened to his talks. You can find Warren Farrell on YouTube. You can find him on a couple of podcasts. I'm pretty sure he was on Joe Rogan. I know he was on Jordan Peterson. He wrote a book called The Boy Crisis, and his arguments, I will not pretend that I can distill all of his arguments into a couple of simple things, but one of the most valuable arguments that the book makes and that he makes from his perspective of study is that the roles of mother and father are pretty universal across mammalian species, and that mothers are primarily responsible. Again, I want to be very clear. Mothers are not only capable of this. Mothers are not limited to this. Mothers are not being glass ceiling held down to only being able to accomplish this. But as a natural expression in mammalian species that are not affected by quote unquote Western Judeo-Christian culture, mothers typically act out what we would consider some of the traditional roles of motherhood, i.e. nurturing, protecting, making sure there was plenty of food on the little cub's plate, if you will, right? And I mean, I'm using, some personification here, metaphorically. And dad's role in the mammalian species is to build, teach, and show boundaries. Now, this is just a real simple explanation for something that, again, as a therapist, I am going to attach myself to that, because how many times, and I mean, I've been hearing this phrase since I was in middle school. As a therapist in my office, how many times do I hear the phrase daddy issues? And almost always, when someone refers to someone else who has daddy issues, or the quote unquote daddy issues that the person in my office is dealing with, what they are really telling me is that there is an area or multiple areas in their life where they have no boundaries. They have the inability to enforce boundaries. They don't know how to build boundaries. They don't know how to be assertive. They don't know how to stand their ground. They don't know how to do all of these things. And associated with that, quite by accident, right? Because this is, let's say that Judeo-Christian culture is not the ones who taught them that to say that they had daddy issues because daddy wasn't around, or he was abusive, or he was in their life and out their life. And then at the same time, that highly correlate with all of these problems in relationships, in career choices, in education, in all of the pursuits of their life, these things are correlated with daddy issues. They can't keep boundaries. They don't know how to protect themselves in a relationship. They don't know how to pursue a career because they can't put a boundary on their time. Right? They can't put a boundary on their interests. So they end up being easily distracted. Right? These are all things. The Boundaries book is an excellent book too. I forget the authors off the top of my head, but this book teaches people to build boundaries. If you read Warren Farrell's work, The Boy Crisis, and you listen to many of his talks, the lack of building boundaries likely comes from the absence of fathers. Take some of the economic data, which I know, he's not super popular because he's way too smart for the typical conservative African American to be, right? But Thomas Sowell makes this argument in his book, Discrimination and Disparities, another book that I have recommended many, many, many times. And he talks about all of the inequalities that we argue for. If you, in the book and in his interview on the Hoover Institution website, Uncommon Knowledge with Peter Robinson, Sowell makes the flat argument that if you control for one variable, and that is the presence of fathers in homes, if you control for that one variable, the inequalities virtually go away in the data, i.e., the disparity between African American men in prison and white men in prison as a percentage of the entire population. And this is according to Sowell's data, not mine. I'm quoting him here. I didn't collect the data nor analyze it. I'm quoting here. He's a Stanford economist. He can stand on his own merits of expertise. If you control for the lack of fathers in homes, the percentages are the same. The difference in the true difference in the populations is the difference in the presence of fathers in homes. Now, this is an argument that a lot of conservative African Americans have been making for a long time. I'm not trying to make that argument because I'm coming from a position in which I shouldn't be speaking to that. Which is why I quote African Americans even when I quote this stuff, even if other people might have data that would be supportive. I understand how, just tepid that water is. However, I want to discuss that from the perspective of what it means to have a fundamentally biological explanation for something. So, i.e., science, to the extent that biology can be hard science. And yet we resist following the science because we don't like the association with a tradition. And we also ignore the fact that our cultures, and this is an argument that I will make. I'm not going to give this one to anybody because I don't know if anybody else would want to take it, but I'll be glad to take it up with anyone else. I think it's a fundamental mistake to separate culture and biology in any true way because they can't totally fragment themselves from one another. If you really believe, and again, I'm going to pause here and say, I don't think evolution and any religious faith has to be mutually exclusive. I know that puts me in a weird place with both camps, but that's irrelevant to me. I think if you believe in a God that is creative enough and magnificent enough to create us from dust, then we should give him credit for all the cool things that our bodies can do and all the cool ways that we can adapt to climate and to temperature and to strength training and to all the other things that we can adapt to. We should give him credit for that too. And he's surely smart enough to have built us to adapt and evolve with our environments. So the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can observe adaptation to the extent that about 90% of the theory of evolution is something we can look at happening, right? Where the theory falls apart is the argument for coming from the primordial ooze or whatever else, and that's not even something Darwin was really willing to do. Some of the some of the Christian apologists were so terrified of Darwin having any kind of an alternative explanation that they didn't even bother to read him, which was very interesting. The man was awe-stricken himself if you ever read what he had to say. But that's irrelevant, and that's me sort of standing on my own soapbox, because we often make comments and have opinions about people, and we don't even listen to what they say. But I don't find the two mutually exclusive. And that's an argument, obviously, that puts me in a bad place with both camps. But the argument, to me, stands, and I'll be glad to chat with anyone about it. However, we think about that, the separation of culture from biology is dumb from an evolutionary perspective, because we had to enculturate to survive. Culture is a mechanism of survival of the fittest in that context. It's a mechanism. Now, does that make all cultures good? No, but it makes the idea of enculturation in and of itself amoral. We have to do it to survive. We can make a monster out of culture in the same way that we can make a monster out of a domesticated dog by abusing it and not feeding it. And we can create a monster by affecting the environment. That's something we see in psychological treatment all the time. And you know where most of the monsters come from? Fatherless homes. Most of the monsters come from fatherless homes. And we can pull out all the data, but I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of numbers and everything else. Just fundamentally understand that there is something about the biological mechanisms of survival. And if this is, I understand that the religious people would say, well, that's how God created it, and that's why. And I am totally on board with that. God created it that way, and it manifests itself in our biology, then awesome. And if the atheist or the sort of anti-God crowd or whatever else says that, or the rational moralist, right? Even the Sam Harris types, who Sam Harris I really like. I like listening to him. I think he's very smart. I think he thinks we're way more rational than we actually are. And I think it's very interesting to me, because that he obviously he's not, I don't want to say it in a negative way, but he obviously hasn't treated trauma, especially not emotional trauma, and he hasn't paid attention to brain function, because everything happens in the limbic system first. We always rationalize after the fact. That's just literally the best we can tell, the best we can see how the brain functions. So there is no way to rationalize before we feel. And feeling almost never makes sense. Almost never. And so whether it's the rationalists that were anti-gods in whatever way, shape, and form, whether they're just flat atheists or they're rationalists saying that we can achieve it without God, we don't need that, whatever else, we're still looking at the biology saying, well, dads play these really important roles, and we can see the negative effects of the absence of dads in all the other mammalian species too. It's not a uniquely human thing. So now, not only do we have the economic data, not only do we have the sociological data, now we have biological data that even crosses species. And that's still not enough science for people to follow, to say, hey, dads are important. But not just dads in the biological sense in which they can provide the biological mechanism, the sperm that fertilizes the egg that creates a child, but fathers who play a role and a function in the upbringing and the management of a child's existence. And it's through boundaries. One of the examples that Warren Farrell gives that I like so much, and I've mentioned it in previous shows, but I want to highlight it here because I think it's maybe the best sort of anecdotal way to understand what we mean. Building boundaries is something that requires a certain level of nuance, and nuance requires practice. And Farrell describes in the boy crisis the need for rough and tumble play, and how dad typically plays that role in mammalian species, and I mean, of course, humans are a part of mammalian species, but certainly in humans as well. Now, rough and tumble play looks something like this, right? Dad's on the floor, offspring, child, male or female. This is not a gender role. Rough and tumble play happens with males and females. And there's a certain level of wrestling that's going on. There's a certain level of rough and tumble play. And the strength is going, right? Obviously, dad is stronger than the children, especially at that point. Pushing, pulling, tugging. Oh, a little bit of hair pulling, but a grabbing a handful and yanking, that's off limits, right? A playful slap or a playful hit is different than a punch in the kidney or the gut or a poke in the eye. And it's during rough and tumble play that these nuanced little differentiations develop. This is acceptable. This is unacceptable. Very difficult to see the difference. But the understanding and the development of nuance is what's taking place in the progress of these children's upbringing. If they are only raised by a mother, they are typically protected beyond the point of even being exposed to the nuance. And that's not because somehow the typical motherly behavior is bad or, unmerited or whatever else. No, because protection is merited. Safety is merited. And mom, with a trusting dad, is willing to allow children to be exposed to things, understanding that the safety and the security of the kids is also important to dad. And this tension in the mother-father role doesn't only exist in humans, it exists in all mammalian species. And this is the argument of the book. This is the argument that Farrell makes that is most interesting. It's the argument that grounds some of these things in the hardest kinds of science that we know. I argue that, like I said, that not most science is not as hard as people, profess it to be anyway. But the hardest kinds of science that we need to know. So let's go ahead and forsake that we're really wanting to make the arguments to follow science. Because we have the science here and we're not going to follow. Or at least our culture is not promoting us to follow. We're finding some other way to deal with disparity than speaking to why the instances of gifts being bought for Mother's Day is somewhere to the tune in the United States 4 times the instances of gifts being bought for Father's Day. The economic data on going out to eat and other things to celebrate Mother's Day. I think Mother's Day is like second to Easter for people going out to eat. Something like that in American holidays right now. And of course, Easter is a very Judeo-Christian holiday, but Mother's Day is second to that. I think Gareth can check that out for me, and we can get back to it. Father's Day is not even making the top 10. What is it about our culture that decided somewhere along the way that the role of mothers and fathers was somehow rooted in an oppressive culture and not the fact that it was a manifestation of something that is ultimately necessary for the appropriate survival of our kids? And again, I'm going to go back to one of the things that I think is most important. And that is biology allows some to be fathers. Many are fathers accidentally. But there's very few that actually take I don't want to say very few, but perhaps a lot fewer than should, that take the responsibility of fatherhood to the extent in which it could be taken. For those, hopefully this show and our careers promote that. Right? I work with Gareth and Sergio on this show, and I know them both personally. I know they're both great fathers. I admire them for that, and I am grateful for the fact that even in having a biological father, right, someone who provided the sperm that fertilized the egg that brought me into this world against many odds, who I don't even know. That doesn't mean that I didn't have a dad that did exactly in my life the things that people like Warren Farrell argue are necessary for the appropriate upbringing of children. Healthy, functional adults are made by healthy, functional parents. And parents with an S is plural on purpose, right? And if you don't believe in God, fine, we can say biology made it that way. But for those of you who believe God made biology, then God made it that way. But it certainly is manifest in the ethos of pretty much all of the religious traditions, not just the mainstream ones. And it's certainly manifest in the biological data and literature, especially for mammalian species of which we are participants. So why do we have a culture that seems to resist that as an important factor, even with all of the evidence to the contrary? And I don't know how to answer that question. I think it's ridiculous that it's even a question that we have to ask. And I especially want to come to terms with the fact that I have an enormous amount of gratitude because I had a man in my life who, at the very least, pledged his time, his energy. He was much older when I was born. He pledged his time and energy to make sure that of all things I had boundaries. I didn't know that's what he was doing. It didn't come across that that's what he was doing. But it was his boundaries. There's several different stories that I could tell about my old pops that would be good anecdotes for the way that these nuances and these boundaries are taught. And to some extent, even though I've kind of been railing for a little while now on the necessity, the absolute necessity of fathers, I really would like to come down to the gratitude of a father. And I imagine that approaching Father's Day and looking at these kinds of situations from the perspective of someone who ended up luckily having both the experience of abandonment, which seems to be such a, well, what can we say, so often happening that it's becoming tradition at this point in our culture. But also a man who made all of the choices to say, I'll do what it takes to make sure this kid has boundaries, has home, has all of the tools that are necessary to function in the world as an adult. He didn't have finances. He didn't have many many material things to give me, if I'm being honest. And I can remember substantially hurting his feelings because I resented being poor, and I remember that. But 3 stories about my dad that I think are important for the nuance of boundaries, and that I hope adequately convey the kind of gratitude that any of us that have a dad in their life perhaps should aspire to. My dad was 47 when I was born, and I can remember living on the little hill by the river where he and Mom decided to raise me. My mom always called it a $100 house with $1 million view. Somehow my dad snuck into a 100-year lease on a piece of air property that was right butted up to the Calcasieu River. But the house that we lived in left much to be desired, a little flat roof, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, fishing camp. I heard the horror stories of it from my mother whenever he first introduced her to the place, because it had been abandoned for a little over a decade when he decided that he was going to renovate it and move in. I'm not entirely sure she could see what it was that he saw in the potential of the place. But I'm glad that he was a man that could see potential, because I have a feeling that that had a lot to do in his effort and intentionality when it came to raising me. It certainly wasn't what I was showing at all times, but he saw the potential. The land itself was very hilly, and my dad had a couple of injuries due to work and other things, and had 5 pretty substantial hip surgeries at that point, and one leg was 3.5 inches shorter than the other. So he had a substantial limp, and the VA insurance that he had didn't want to pay for the shoe extenders for whatever reason. So he had these crutches that they got him, and he would hop around on those crutches. But he was tough. So that hilly land that was butted up to the river, he would push mow it because that was the mower we could afford. And to be honest, even if we could have afforded a riding lawnmower, it really wouldn't cut the grass smoothly because of all the hills. And he would cut the grass and he would rake the yard until, of course, I was old enough. And then, a strapping young boy, it's time to get out there and earn your keep, right? Well, the time I started cutting grass and raking the leaves, I didn't even have a bedroom to sleep in. I was still sleeping on a hideaway bed that we would fold up and put on the screen porch every morning whenever I woke up. And then I was sleeping in the living room, basically. But it was that first year that I really started cutting grass. I was 10 years old. And they also built me a bedroom that same year where the screen porch used to be, and I was super grateful for it. I had my own space for the first time when I was 10 or 11 years old. My dad got used to keeping me up when I was a kid and telling me that I needed to cut grass. But it was in my high school years. If I'm being honest, I don't know exactly how old I was, but I know it wasn't my first year in high school, and I knew I wasn't a senior. I knew I wasn't graduating. So I was a sophomore or a junior. My dad had told me and gotten used to me, cutting the grass when it needed cutting. In the summers in Louisiana, you cut grass every week, right? If it's not raining, you could cut grass every 5 days. Certainly it's not going past 2 weeks, or else you could hire out a really good sized dog in the grass. Well, I'd let the grass go, and I'd let the leaves go. It was late summer, early fall. I know I was in school, so August, September. Bunch of leaves and pine needles on the ground. Grass is uncut. Dad had been asking me to do it for a couple of, probably close to 2 weeks already. So that means it was well past. And he was older at this point. He was 47 when I was born. So when I was 15 years old, he'd be 63, right? And so I come home from school and he's outside. He's already cut most of the yard and he's raking away from the house all the extra leaves. And I guess you'd have to see him to know that he's got his crutch on one arm and he's kind of leaning on it, and he's got the rake in his hand and it's kind of folded under his elbow, and he's sweeping his elbow to rake the yard, and he has raked a substantial portion of the yard in this really bizarre looking way after having cut most of it, being in his early 60s and crippled. And so I see him cutting the grass when I come around the house, or raking the yard, and I immediately am upset. Right? My emotions get the best of me because he's out there, and I know he's hurting, and I know he's asked me, and I feel the guilt of knowing that there was a responsibility of mine that I let go to someone else, that someone else happened to be the person who taught me the boundary of responsibility. The one that says, these are the things you do for yourself. Because it would be not only impolite, but it's not showing yourself as a fit survivor. Right? You're not fit for survival if you're unwilling to take responsibility for yourself and to expect others to do it. And so I immediately go in the house, throw my books in my room, change into some work clothes, and I come out, and I remember some of the most tense experiences I ever had with my dad was in that 15 minutes where I told him, give me the rake. And he looked at me and said, no. And then I went, kind of laughing, like, this is playful. I went to grab the rake, and he turned with some speed and let it hit me right in the chest and the arm. And he said, go back in the house. I don't want you to help me today. And I stepped back. I mean, the man had never hit me. I stepped back and, what's going on, Pops? Don't want your help today. I would like for you to go back in the house. And I was still a 15-year-old kid. I was like, well, that's stupid. I can't believe you just let me do it. I didn't do it, or whatever else. He was like, well, you can start by apologizing that you haven't been doing something that I've asked you to do. But you're not going to make up for it because you're motivated by guilt. You're going to go inside until the guilt passes. And that and many other things in my life became a boundary that my dad taught me. And one of his favorite phrases was, the right thing for the wrong reason is just the wrong thing. And the boundary that he taught me that day was that some action completed that was motivated by guilt to do the right thing will never achieve, even if it's the same action, it will never achieve the same outcome as the action that is motivated by love or desire or taking responsibility or initiative or any of the other positive motivators. And this in and of itself is an example of the nuanced difference between boundaries that we make in our life. So many of the quote unquote right things that we do, if they're motivated by guilt, have little to no effect in an outcome. And this might be why the religious traditions seem to struggle at times. This might be why people who are just merely trying to, quote unquote, be people pleasers aren't getting the satisfaction out of the relationships that they're trying to pursue. Because what we're not doing is we're not taking the one extra nuanced step that the boundary builders, fathers, can teach us. I'm not saying mothers couldn't teach us this. So, I want to get out of the stupid political weeds when it comes to that. This is not saying that women are incapable of this and that only men are capable of this. It's saying that these roles, these shared roles that create tension on each other because it pulls a kid out of a place of safety and security to make them feel the pain of not fulfilling responsibility and not letting them self-soothe their pain by a quick action motivated by guilt. They absolve themselves by immediately acting, but nothing really ever settles in. And the way to absolve guilt is by this immediate guilt-driven action, and it never changes their responsibility-taking habits. Maybe this is why the whole Christian ethos rests on Jesus Christ himself dissolving guilt. And all of the epistles having the similar theme of motivations of mercy and love. And particularly the book of James, but this is also echoed in Paul and John and Peter and Jude. That justice is not a healthy motivator, but that mercy is. Because what justice wants to do is it wants to react because of guilt. Mercy has to be more intentional than that. And it took a father to teach me. I can remember particularly being punished for some misbehavior that I don't even recall. And I can remember that the punishment I thought was much too severe for the crime. And so, again, this was somewhere in high school. I was, of course, making all of the merits for why I thought it was too harsh. But one thing my mom and dad never did was they never disagreed about me in front of me. Whether or not they did behind closed doors, I would never know. Something I try to teach parents, in fact, not just because my parents did it, but if you ever give a clever child the opportunity to pit one parent against the other, they're always going to take that opportunity. But what really happened here was that I entered into a negotiation in which I was arguing for justice. And I was not really paying attention to, obviously, the value. What adolescent is going to pay attention to the value of punishment? What am I learning from losing the privileges that I had lost, right? My friends were going to a camp out or doing something very fun, and I was like 4 days from my punishment, and the camp out was from the end of my grounding, and the camp out was gonna go over the end of it. Some way I was arguing that I should get those 4 days because the camp out's gonna be over after my punishment's over, everything else. And I knew that my mom was the main vehicle behind the length of time that I was punished. Again, my memory is not conceiving or exactly right, but I have a feeling that it had something to do with grades because the time specific to grades was 6 weeks, and I remember being punished for 6 weeks. And I basically had to have the evidence of a report card to prove that I had sort of learned my lesson, if that made sense, and to earn back my privileges. And when I was grounded, I was grounded. I didn't have a TV in my room. That was pre-cell phone, at least pre-Zach Morris cell phone. And we certainly couldn't afford one of those when they first came around anyway. But no video games. I had nothing to do but read books. That was it. I was punished a lot, so I read a lot of books. Maybe that helped my academic career. Who knows? I made all of these fancy arguments. I was very impassioned. My mom was very determined, and she always was. And there was a little bit of an emotional spat amongst the three of us, in which my dad, like he normally did, sat there quietly in the recliner while my mom was really upset with me and threatening to extend the punishment because I was creating such a fuss about this. And it had her leaving the room and me sitting on the sofa, my dad in his recliner, me just mumbling under my breath how stupid all of this really was. Dad pointed to a bookshelf. There was a little red book. He said, grab that book. And so I grabbed the book, opened it up, and what it was his Marine Corps yearbook. Well, basically his yearbook, right? His graduating class. So Dad's story is that in the 50s, you could get away with this, right? Because there were not computers analyzing everything or whatever else. But he snuck his older brother's birth certificate when he was about to be 16. Enrolled in the Marine Corps because he wanted to go to Korea to fight. Snuck in at 16. Ended up going through 26 weeks of boot camp because of a shipping problem, and they go through the first 13 weeks, and then for whatever reason they were not able to ship out to the Philippines or wherever they were basing over there during the Korean War, and they missed that boat and they just got stuck there. And you can't be stuck there at Marine Corps boot camp with your feet up on the recliner, so they just made them go do it again. Well, you're going to go with the next class, then you're going to ship out the next class. That means you got to work out with the next class. And so 26 weeks of Marine Corps boot camp in the 50s, right? I'm not a Marine. I'm not in the military. I can invite anybody on, whatever else. From everything I've heard and read, boot camp in the 50s is a lot different than boot camp in 2020. I'll just say it like that. So 26 weeks of that, and then he goes to Korea. For 26 weeks, and he's telling me the story while I'm looking through his yearbook, right after my mom had kind of melted down and left the room, and I had kind of, under my breath, bemoaned the fact that I had these unreasonable and stupid parents. And so he tells me this story. He's like, I don't like talking about Korea. I saw a lot of stuff I don't ever want to think about. He said, but those 26 weeks in San Diego, I've never lived with less sleep, never been more tired, never been more proud of my accomplishments. He said, but there was a drill sergeant there who, at any given time, would blow this terribly high-pitched whistle. And he said, anytime we heard that whistle, our instructions were hit the deck, take cover immediately, get as low as you can from wherever you're at. He said, for 26 weeks, I slept on a top bunk. It didn't matter if we were in water. It didn't matter if I was in a tree. It didn't matter if I was sleeping in the top bunk. Every time I heard that whistle, I hurled myself at the ground. By the end of 26 weeks, he said, I could not think of another human being who I hated more than that one drill sergeant. He said, I can remember the few nights that I got winks of sleep dreaming about just choking that guy. And just watching him not breathe and it being something pleasurable to me. I said, and then we shipped out. And of course, we all talked and complained and, got on about it and everything else. He said, now, because our shipment was late, we ended up being a group of trainees that once we got to Korea, we were almost immediately dispersed to fill in gaps. And he said, I remember my first Jeep ride toward a combat zone. He said, I was just sitting in the back of the Jeep, terrified, just like any other 16-year-old kid that was about to go to war would be. I heard that whistle. And he said, it was as if my body threw itself to the ground. I had been so programmed that when I hear it, I hit the ground. It was just something that was absolutely conditioned in me. And I never saw anything, but I felt the pressure of an explosion and the heat melt the hair on the back of my neck. And the explosion pressed me into the mud. And then as I turned around to try to make sense of what was going on, the Jeep was in flames. The people that were still in it burned up. And me alive because I threw myself out of a Jeep racing through a landing zone. Because a drill sergeant had for 26 weeks drilled into me. Figuratively and somewhat literally. The fact that if you ever hear this, you hit the ground. Turns out that drill sergeant had happened on a whistle that sounded eerily similar to a Chinese weapon, probably a Soviet weapon, very akin to the modern RPG, which North Koreans were able to actually get into trees and other places in the bushes that were a lot more difficult to see and fire, and they were causing a lot of damage over there. And he just happened on the fact that he had this whistle that sounded really similar to when one of those things fired. And it wasn't a protocol. It wasn't something that came down from the Corps. It wasn't something that Uncle Sam was doing for everybody. It just happened that I got stuck for 26 weeks with a drill sergeant who knew something that not a lot of other people knew. This is what this sounds like, and the best thing you could do if you ever hear this sound is get down. And of course, I'm a 15-year-old kid, but I do have somewhat of a heart, and I'm listening to this, and Dad's kind of tearing up talking about it, and he's telling me this long story, and I mean, it's obviously emotionally kind of raw and real there and everything else. And he looked at me and he said, your mom and I might never make sense to you, but always know this: if we ever choose to hurt you, we're only hurting you when we have to, so that we can help you when you need us to. And there's a nuance there that doesn't exist if you don't have the tension in the relationship, if you don't have the teamwork and the process and the life experience and all the other nuanced stuff that comes with someone who's willing to make boundaries. And to put those final touches on what it takes to be functional because functionality is a key to survival. But function is more painful than it is pleasurable most of the time. I argued in the episode we did on mental fitness that I think there's something about biology that teaches us that we have to find the right amount of death. Intermittent fasting and ketoacidosis are successful because they're telling us and they're promoting and they're communicating that our bodies are allowing their cells to die, and cancer is what happens when cells refuse to die. And the pain of muscles tearing, the pain of experience, etc. Those things, those little pains, are the things that make the future possible. Those are the things that contribute to survival. Those are the things, the responsibility and the pain and responsibility today is what promotes the opportunity, the fitness, the ability to survive tomorrow. I don't know that there's a better thing to say here than kudos to every father who has ever intentionally played the role of dad for the purpose of creating a functional adult out of an offspring. Whether intentional or unintentional, whether biological or adopted, whether family or stranger, kudos to the people that were willing to be dads. Happy Father's Day from the State of Wellness, and we'll see you next time.